Believe more and fear less. And today, in order to fear less, we're talking about fear games and understanding how fear plays those games with us. And not that it's a game to you, but we need to understand how fear affects our human bodies. And even though we are trying to be spiritual and walking in the spirit and trying to recognize God in our lives, fear is still a very much part of how God created us. And so thanks for joining us. I want to say welcome again, and thanks. This is I'm welcoming you to part 2 of the series on fearless. Today, as we dig into the games that fear play, sometimes we think that fear is something to be conquered, something to overcome. And there are certain times that you do need to overcome whatever fears are affecting you. But there are different levels of fear. And at some point, some fears become irrational. And we need to understand when they are, how do we overcome those irrational fears? How those fears are affecting us, even though they are real. There are ways that we can learn to deal with them, because in the first place, God hardwired us to fear. Can you imagine that? And I know a lot of the ministry that I've received concerning fear is always as if fear is negative. We need to get rid of it, and you need to conquer it, and you need to put it under your feet. Well, fear is something that God built into you and built into me. And so don't be alarmed if you do fear. It's natural. And you are natural. And so today, as we talk about fear games, I want you to recognize that there's nothing wrong with fear, but the problem is the way we respond to all the different forms of fear. And so I have some questions for you to just to get started today, and to bring get us all on the same page when we think about fear, when we're talking about fear. And that question is this. And think about this. What are some of your greatest fears now? Last week I asked you about some fears in the past. But what are some of your greatest fears now? And how are you responding to those fears? Or even if you just want to call them uncertainties. How are you responding to those? How are you dealing with those fears? I think about some terrible things that have happened during our lifetime. Since 9/11, for example, 2001, that's been almost 20 years ago. So 19 plus years, there are people who still fear flying because of what happened almost 20 years ago, even though flying, even accounting for the terrorism during 9/11, flying is still the most safest way to travel. So when you think about just the facts versus the fears that we have, it's easy for us to just look at the emotional part and look at what is out in front of us. For example, a lot of what we see is what the news media show us and what they emphasize. And what they emphasize is really what brings them dollars. And that's for all of them. They all do that. If they didn't do that, they probably wouldn't be in business. But they are, even what they choose to report on is based on what is popular. It's just like it is when you go into your your search engine, whether it's Google or Bing or whatever one your favorite one is. When you put in a search, it brings you the most relevant search based on what you're looking for. And that the news media do the same thing. They all do the same thing. Whatever is that the people are asking for, and whether it's good or bad, and most of the times it's bad, that's what they end up reporting on. And so a lot of fear drives, believe it or not, fear drives a whole lot of business. And so we need to understand how the games of fear is played so that we can win ourselves and understand, what's going on. So if you'd like to respond to some of that, I'll watch the queue. What are some of your greatest fears now? I mentioned 9/11 and fear of flying. There are a lot of fears that have become permanent now since, terrorism. For example, the Boston Marathon bombing. We're always kind of thinking about something going to happen. Is something going to happen? The Paris massacre. We were just seems like caught off guard, and then the shooting in the nightclub in Orlando, the school shootings, all of these different things that are bombarding our minds. And then especially just recently, the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Just it's crazy, and we have to. I mean, our minds. You can't ignore this, and not just wonder what in the world is next. How maybe you fear racism, maybe you fear civil war. A lot of these things that there's some reality to some of this, and so fear is not just something that we need to be afraid of, or it's funny, be afraid of fear. Fear is not something that we need to try to avoid in itself, but we do need to learn how to deal with it. And I believe that's what God is having me to minister on this in this series, because of there's so much in the world that we have to deal with, that we need to understand how to manage ourselves and how we can become more valuable to the people around us, our loved ones, the people that depend on us, and not allow fear to drive our lives. So if you will, let's dig into this. And again, the purpose of fear, as I said last week, the overall purpose of fear is to protect you. It's for survival. It's to keep you safe. Fear, and that's what God gave it to us for. But then there's different levels of fear, and even though it's designed to keep us safe, even if there is no threat, if there's something that's unknown or unfamiliar, there's some level of fear about it. And when we start to fear, there's certain things that start to happen in our brain because of the way that we're designed, that keeps us in the mode of fear when we should not be. The threat may be gone, and we still have all of the things that, the emotions and the response to the emotions to keep us safe, even though there really isn't a threat. And it could be just because you think there is a threat. Think about this. If you, and maybe you have, have you ever had a dream where something was going on in the dream, and when you woke up out of the dream, your heart was beating fast, you were breathing fast, and you were sweating, and you were in bed, sleep, resting, but your emotions were going through all of the different changes, and that's because that's happening in it's the same part of your brain where instinct comes from, and that's where that's the part that fear uses. And I'm going to go over that a little bit more today. But even though it's there to keep you safe, then sometimes when the threat is gone and we're still in that mode, it creates a lot of problems for us. And so when we look at the purpose of fear, and there has to be a balance, between what I call risk and safety. When you have low risk, you need to be able to deal with that in a way where you can make some decisions where you can take on some risk, even though, you still want to be safe, but you can take on some risk and then still have safety. And when we fear a person, that's a different kind. I mean, that's a different kind of fear. When you fear a person, one of the things that starts to happen, and this is very dangerous, one of the things that starts to happen when you fear someone is that you start to dehumanize them. And it happens all the time, especially in racism. If someone fear you, they start to dehumanize you, and you unconsciously do the same thing of people that you fear. So we need to learn how to lower, the risk or whatever we think the risk is. And remember last week, and I'm going to jump right into the scripture. Last week we talked about where Jesus was on the boat with his disciples. You remember? And they were in a storm and Jesus was sleeping, and the disciples came and eventually woke him up because they thought they were going to drown. They woke him up and they said, "Master, don't you care that we perish?" And I want to focus on this one verse today and another occasion where Jesus asked the same type of question, because it's the things that this question brings out of us that helps us to deal with what's going on the inside of us. And so he said to his disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Remember, they had been, excuse me, they had been fighting the storm, and they finally woke Jesus up and said, "Master, we're perishing." And when they woke him up, Jesus quieted the storm, spoke to the waves, and said, "Peace, be still." And the sea was calm and the winds were calm. And then he said to his disciples, this verse that you're looking at now, then he said to them, "Why are you so afraid?" See, that's interesting to me. Seems like Jesus would know why they were afraid. They thought they were going to die. They thought that, when I look at how Matthew described this, even though Mark used something different, but they all said it was a great storm. But the Greek word that Matthew used is the same word that measures our earthquakes. It's seismos. And so this was a big, the word that the King James Version translated in this is tempest. The tempest is raging. That original Greek word is seismos. So he's saying something serious is happening, and we're out here on the water, and if you don't do something, we're going to die. And so, but when Jesus spoke to the waves and the wind, then he said to them, "Why are you so afraid?" Tell me this. Why do you think Jesus even asked this question? How do you think he could even, fathom, doesn't he know why they're afraid? And I'm sure, he knows, he knew what was going on in their minds, going on in their hearts. So I believe the benefit of this question is so that we can ask ourselves this question, so that we can get to the root of how fear controls us. Because the next thing he said is, "Do you still have no faith?" Why are you so afraid? And do you still have no faith? And when we think of fear and when we think of faith and we think of those two opposite ends of the spectrum, we think our faith is something that it's almost like some force that we muster up. And as I said last week, our faith has to be in a person. You don't have faith in a thing. You have faith in God and your relationship with God and your relationship with Jesus. When your relationship is intact, then you can take on some risk because you know who has your back. You know who is in relationship with you. And so when he said, "Why are you so afraid?" The foundation of that question has to do with, "I am here with you, and why are you so afraid?" And even then, they may have been thinking, "Yeah, but you're asleep, and we're dealing with the storm." And they also may have been thinking, "But yeah, you're God's son, and we're not. And so, save us." But I want us to ask ourselves this question this week and see what happens once you understand how fear works. I started explaining a little bit last week of how fear works. I want to go into that a little bit, even as we understand why Jesus asked this question and look at that. There are 4 stages of fear. And so what happens first is suspicion. It's something that's different, something that I don't understand. And with that suspicion, we start using our imagination, and then our imagination goes to work. And then that takes us to the next level. If we get past that level or that stage of fear, Because what normally happens in that stage and what the danger is when we get ahead of the actual events and start imagining what bad things could happen. And that's the very first stage of fear. And I believe that's the stage that God is trying to keep us out of if we don't need to be. And there are ways to find out whether you need to be or not. And if you do, you need to go through all the different phases and do what it takes for for the purpose of fear to do its job, which is to protect you. And so the second stage is fear, and that's the body and mind. That's where, and I'm going to go through these so that we can understand these a little bit better. But there are 4 stages. The second stage is fear itself, and that's where fear starts to take on and do its instinctive things in your body and also in your mind. And then we're going to talk about the 3 F's, their instinctive responses. So when fear starts to do these things, then we start to respond based on our instincts. And then the last stage of fear is the memories that fear creates. Fear creates memories so that you can pull those memories down when something else happened, and then it brings up the same fears again. So we're gonna talk about that. But what I believe that Jesus was trying to do by asking that question is in the very first stage of fear, which is suspicion and imagination. In that very first stage, I think he's trying to get us to pause those instinctive responses that we have. And that's why he asked the question, why? Why? Why are you so afraid? Why are you so afraid? And you need to ask yourself that question whenever you are faced with whatever fears that you're faced with. You need to ask yourself, not that the question gets rid of the fear, but you need to ask yourself, why am I afraid? Why, let's just take, for example, the fear of speaking, which is one, believe it or not, which is one of the greatest fears that there is. The fear of speaking in front of people. And let's say you're afraid of speaking in front of people. You need to ask yourself why, and your answer to that question may be different than someone else's answer to that question. But to overcome those barriers which become irrational is that you need to answer that question for yourself and then deal with those answers. And I believe that you can deal with them better if we understand how fear works. So remember last week when I told you that one of the first things that happen in fear is that the thalamus, which is that part right in the middle there, that orange part in the middle that you can see there, that part receives data from all of our senses. And so when it receives that data, all it's doing is just taking in data. That's the very first part of your brain that fear starts to get involved. Now, and by itself, that doesn't do the job, because the next part of your brain that works and that makes a difference there is the sensory cortex, and that's the little bluish green part that's at the top. It's right, and that's more towards the front. That's the thinking part of our brain. And the other parts are near the back, and it's more of the emotional part of our brain. So you can see how our emotions and our thinking start to work together. And God designed us this way. It's not like, remember, God designed us. He designed the brain. And so the sensory cortex then interprets this data that comes in from your eyes, come in from, your even what you feel. Just think about it. Some of these fears are so instinctive. You can feel something. It could be the wind blowing on your arm and blowing the hairs on your arm, but it feels like something's crawling and you have a fit, because you don't know what it is. And many times our response is what hurts us rather than whatever it is that we were afraid of. But your sensory cortex, that green part, is what interprets this data. And guess what? This is what's interesting to me. As I was doing more research this week, I learned that it is impossible to avoid thinking the worst when this happens. You're going to think the worst. You know how some people say, stop stop thinking the worst. Why are you always thinking the worst? You're starting to think the worst because your brain wants to take you there so that you can take action to protect yourself from the worst. And so that's how God designed us. It's not something that we need to try to get rid of. And that's all happening in the very first stage of fear. And that happens when our imagination goes to work there, because we got data. We see something we may not understand at all, and we're starting to take it in with the sensory cortex and try to interpret it. But our imagination, if in this stage our imagination takes over and gets ahead of the data, then we will make irrational decisions that have our body taking the next step, and there really is no threat that we need to take those steps for. So now that's all the suspicion and the imagination part. See, the way that breaks down is that you're thinking about all the things that could happen, all the things that might happen. And so the fear is preparing your body to face those things. And that's why you can't avoid thinking the worst, because it's going to take, unless you get data that backs you off of that, you're going to think the worst. And it's okay to think the worst, but then get the data so that you can realize whether the worst, excuse me, could possibly happen or not. Now, the next part of your brain, the next part of your brain that goes to work in the fear process is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus, it stores, and retrieves whatever your conscious memories are, not like what's going on right now, so that your cortex can have this data, even, as it compiles it all together. It's kind of like RAM memory. It's kind of like RAM memory, readily accessed memory that you are using and computing with right now. And so that process, it takes sets of things that stimulate. In other words, what you see with your eyes, and it also takes in what you feel, if you smell something, all of these things coming in, all this data coming in, and you're trying to give some context to this data. And then that moves you to the second stage of fear. So now this moves you to the point of the second stage of fear, which is fear itself. The second stage of fear, it has to do with your body and your mind. So please pay attention to this. Let me give you this in a bigger form so that you can see this. This is the second stage of fear. Now, we've already imagined, and sometimes the worst, but now here comes the feelings of fear because of what we're imagining. Even though the worst hasn't happened yet, the feelings of fear comes, and all these things starts to happen. You can't control this. Once you cross that threshold to the second level of fear, your adrenaline glands go to work, which it gives us a burst of energy, and it also sends extra blood to your big muscles so that you can be prepared to do whatever you need to do. And you'll find out that there's basically three things that you're going to do, but this stage of fear is getting you ready for whatever you need to do. And it turns off your digestive system. This is amazing. The body, the mind that God created us with, it's amazing. It increases your breathing. All of this is to prepare you so that you can take the next step. But the next thing that it does, though, it also increases your heart rate. Your heart rate goes up, and it turns off your immune system. See, some of the things we're not aware of that fear does when it gets to this level. It turns off your immune system because you need all of the energy that you can get to do what you need to do to save your life. And that's where fear comes in. It's trying to get you to take steps to save your life or to protect yourself. It also heightens at this stage of fear, your vision is heightened. And basically it's heightened because you got tunnel vision. All you can see is what you're looking for, and which could be dangerous. But if the threat really is there, that is what you need to see. If the threat is real, you need tunnel vision. You don't need any distractions. If the threat is real, you need to see what's happening so you can take the steps to avoid danger or death in some cases. And so all of these things that happen in our bodies, that that the part of our brain, the hippocampus, the part that it controls, all of these things are fine and dandy if the threat is real. The problem is if the threat is not real and we still go through these same stages. You see, but for example, if there's no threat but you think there is, and you believe that there is for long periods of time, because your body is in this state of, sending more blood to your large muscles, it's shutting down your immune system, all of these things that it's doing, shutting down your digestive system, it creates problems when you're in this stage for a long time, because you're not designed to be in a state of fear for hours and hours and hours. That should be something quick, so you can, you're going to do a couple things. You're either going to run, or you're going to fight, or you're going to just freeze. You're going to stay. Those are the three things, and we'll get to those. But you can see from all the things that's happening, if you maintain this for long periods of time, that's why people that are stressed out have a lot of disease. That's why they're sickly. It's because your body can't do its normal thing. All of the energy that should be used so that your immune system works, you're using that because you're stressed out because of what you think might happen. And so we have to learn how to undo some of these things so that our body, that God can work the way God designed it to work. Now, the next part of the brain is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is that part of the brain. It's right in the middle of the thalamus, but this is the hypo part of this. It activates. This is the part that, saying, okay, boom, now it's time to work, time to go, time to act. Once you get past this, there's no going back. Your body's going to do what it's designed to do based on the fear that you perceive that there is, even if it's not real. It's going to activate what I call the 3 Fs, the flight, fight, or freeze response. You either going to run, or you're going to fight, or you're paralyzed. You can't do anything. One of those three things is how you are going to respond. Now, I thought about this as I was preparing for this, and you can think of different. I'm sure you can. You can think of different times that fear has kind of taken over you. I must have been about 12 years old, and I was out in front of my uncle's house, out in the country, and there's a house across the road. Not very many houses on the road, period. But this house, they had some dogs, and like you and many of you, I don't know why, seems like we just grew up being afraid of dogs. I did. I don't know. So I grew up being afraid of dogs. So there must have been about 4 or 5 dogs across the road, and I'm walking. And I had been running, but I realized if I ran, they were going to chase me. That's what my brain was telling me. So I slowed down so I could walk, so they could think I was doing something normal, and they would just keep on about their own business. But I had my eye on them, even though I was pretending that I was ignoring them. You know how you do when you're trying to avoid whatever the danger is. And so I saw these dogs, and they started talking to each other. And they decided that they were going to chase me. Now, they all lunged at me about the same time and just started rushing me. They were about 20, 30 feet away, and they all started rushing me, coming towards me, it seems like with all the energy and force that they could. And when I think about what what I'm telling you about the flight, fight, and freeze, I must have done two of these things at the same time because I started to run. This was a gravel road, but I must have had so much energy. The first step to run, I just slipped and fell. And all the dogs just came right up to where I was. And guess what? They just turned around and said, "Oh, he's scared," and they went on about their business. Once they scared me out of my wits, they went on, but no dog bit me. They never even touched me. They just came up. It was just fear itself. But you're going to respond based on what is happening because your body is going to try, and I really don't believe any of those dogs would have caught me if I could have had my grips on my feet because my energy was, ready to go. And but you're gonna respond three different ways, and that's what I call the three F's. And they're instinctive. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to think, I need to run here. That's you don't even need that. That's not that's not even consideration. You don't have to think about it. Your body already knows what you need to do, and it's telling you what you need to do. So you're gonna either fight, you either gonna run, or you're gonna freeze. And when you, of course, fight means you're protecting yourself. And a lot of times that doesn't happen unless you're put in a corner, and that's your only option. But you will fight. And when someone fights out of fear, you need to realize that it's instinct, and somebody's going to get hurt because they think they're going to die. So, and you've heard me say this before if you've listened to me for any period of time. That's one reason why I don't like to fight, because honestly, my greatest fear would be if I don't take care of you now, you're going to come back and try to take care of me later. So I would be afraid to leave you alive. That's how fear works. And so either you're going to fight, or you're going to run, or you're going to freeze. And when you freeze, we're just talking about freezing means that you're numb. You don't do anything. You're paralyzed. You shrink and you hide, or in some situations you just comply with whatever's going on. It's like you're taking yourself out of any. Your response is really to do nothing, but it's fear that's driving that response, and you should do something. See, many of you probably didn't even realize that was one of the responses, and then sometimes you're thinking you're doing nothing, but that's fear driving that decision. You need to do something. Some of you are hiding from things, and it's fear that's driving you to hide. You need to come out and allow yourself to be seen and heard, and you need to face whatever it is that you're hiding from. And so now the next part of the brain that is at work in this is called the amygdala. Now the amygdala, it takes all your emotions, that part of your brain that is just emotion, and that's what happens really when we start to do irrational things. Is it becomes irrational when we get to this stage of fear, because the emotional part of the brain takes over, and when it does, it blocks out the sensory cortex. The sensory cortex, there's no one can rationalize with you. Nobody's going to get you to understand when you're in the middle of this. And so the amygdala, that's what decodes the emotions and determines the threat levels. But it also stores fear memories. Now, that's the big part of what it does that affects us so hard, is because as it stores fear memories, you remember what happened the last time this happened. And it doesn't, the events haven't even happened yet, but your fear and your body starting to respond because of the way you dealt with it the last time. And that's how fear just keeps driving you to one place to the next place where you feel like you can't do anything. So let's understand this, this part that we're talking about. Everything is recorded in your mind. This part that we're talking about with fear in the body and the mind, because we have to learn how to allow our minds. That's why Jesus stopped the disciples and said, "Why are you afraid?" He had to bring them out of their instinct of fear so they could start thinking and remembering. For one thing, they need to remember is that he was on board of that ship. So everything is recorded in your minds, especially the events, that were stressful, the events that were intensely emotional. Those things are imprinted on our minds, and that fear brings those memories up, and you start to deal with them right away. For example, let's say you have a brand new relationship, but you've been in an old relationship and you had some old memories, you were hurt, where those memories, think about this. That new person in the new relationship may be the best thing in the world for you, and you may think you love them, and you may love them, they may love you, but what drives your action is those memories of the past relationship if you don't deal with those, because fear is trying to protect you from a perceived danger, even though the person may not bring you any danger, but you perceive the danger because of your old relationship. And if you don't learn how to deal with fear and think like Jesus told the disciples, why are you afraid? If you don't have the courage to ask yourself that question and write down some answers so that you can dig down deep inside of yourself and understand where this fear is coming from, you will still ruin the next relationship and the next relationship. And it's not just like marriage, but even in business, you'll be afraid to do transactions because of the last thing that happened. So we have to learn how to deal with these fears so that we can so that you can live a normal life, a joyful life, the life that Jesus planned for you to live. And so we need to learn. See, one of the things that happen also when you do this, there's also missed opportunities, because with opportunity there's some risk for opportunities. That's why you don't need to make fear your enemy. Fear has its place, but we need to learn from it and learn to control it and not allow it to control us, because it is there to protect us and from any perceived danger, but we need to make sure that the danger is really a threat and not just something that we perceive that to be a threat. So I want to use another scripture to show you how Jesus still dealt with this. And this is in the book of Luke, the last chapter of Luke. And if you want to turn there with me, the 24th chapter and the 38th verse. Now, what had happened here, this is after the resurrection. And you can see the question that Jesus asked, why are you frightened, he asked, why are your hearts filled with doubt? Now, let me set this up for you. This is after the resurrection. This is like the Sunday, the first day of the week after Jesus. The women, Mary Magdalene and a couple other ladies have gone to the tomb where Jesus was expected to be. And think about this. They expected him to be there even though he had told them that he was going to be in the grave for 3 days and that God was going to raise him up from the dead. And the ladies went to, with some fragrances to embalm his body basically. And they realized when they got there, the stone had been rolled away. And when they looked, there was nobody in the tomb. And they still didn't think that what he said in the past was what had happened. Their imagination took them someplace else, even the women. But they said, they ran and they told the 11 disciples, there's nobody in the tomb. We've gone. The stone is rolled away. But even the disciples, they still didn't believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Peter ran, John ran, they all ran down to the tomb and looked inside. And the scripture even tells us when Peter came out, he wondered what could have happened. Can you imagine that? You know, and that's us looking back, but they were in this first stage of fear, and they were, they were afraid of a lot of things at this point, because if they killed Jesus and they were identified with Jesus, being a part of Jesus, then they could be next. And so they were all frightened. And now he's actually appeared to a couple of guys. And when I say guys, these are other disciples, not a part of the 11, but a part of the overall group of disciples. And they were walking down the road, and Jesus spent some time with them, and they didn't even know it was him. He's talking to them. He's saying, what's going on? And Jesus saying, what's all the fuss about? And they're saying, where have you been? Are you some kind of, visitor that you don't know what's happened over the last couple of days? And he said, what? And think about this. Jesus is saying to them, like he's egging them on. He says, so what happened? And they said, well, Jesus was crucified. First of all, we believe he was a prophet of God, and he came, and then the high priest, turned him over to the Romans for crucifixion, and they crucified him. And although he said he was going to be raised the third day, so women went down to the tomb, and now his body's gone. And as Jesus is talking to them, he starts to explain to them from the scripture, even from Isaiah and other scriptures, that they were part of their repertoire of scripture, saying that the Son of Man was going to come, he was going to die, and he was going to be raised from the dead. And he started explaining all this to them as they're walking down the road. And then they get to their place where they're stopping to go home, and Jesus pretends that he's going to continue down the road, and they say to him, it's late in the evening, why don't you come and spend the evening with us? And he decides to go. So they sat there, and he eats with them, and that's when they understood that was him. Then these two guys ran and told the other disciples that Jesus is alive. We've seen him. And as they were speaking to the 11 disciples, Jesus, get ready for this now, Jesus appeared in the room. He just appeared in the room. And they were frightened. He says to them, why are you frightened? Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Now, this is their natural instincts alone. And remember, they were pondering the worst. So here they see him. He appears in the room. Now, I got a question for you. What do you think Jesus did to remove their fear? What do you think Jesus did to help them get rid of their fear? What do you think Jesus did so that they could deal with their fear? Did he pray for them to have courage? What do you think he did? Anybody, just type in give me some feedback there. What do you think Jesus did to help them deal with their fear? Did he, what, we'll look at the next verse and we'll see what he actually did. But when Jesus asked that question, he didn't wait for them to respond. I believe that they were in the state of fear where they were frozen. They weren't going to run, and they didn't need to fight. They were just frozen. They were just complying with whatever's happening now. I have no control of this. So what Jesus did is he engaged their senses. Look at what the next verse says he did. He said, look at my hands, look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. He engaged their senses. He didn't tell them to believe. He didn't tell them to pray and so that God can give them faith to see that it was him. He engaged their senses. He said, look, use your eyeballs, look at my hands with the nail holes in them. Use your eyes, look at my feet with the nail holes in them. And if that's not enough, if your eyes alone is not enough to get the data to your the part of your brain that gets you to stop just only using your emotions, but take in some information. He said, the next verse said, he said, touch me and make sure that I'm not a ghost. Because that's what they had said when he said, they said, well, we thought you were a ghost. He said, touch me and make sure that I'm not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies, as you see that I do. So really what Jesus is saying here, he's telling them, put your instincts on pause. You don't have to get rid of it, but put your instincts on pause and use your senses with the thinking part of your brain and bring some context to what you see in front of you. That's how you get rid of fear. There's nothing supernatural about it. You were designed this way. He said, touch me. First he said, look at my hands, look at my feet. Then he said, touch me and make sure that I'm not a ghost. In other words, you touch me, your hand doesn't go through my hand. You touch me, I am a real person. Ghosts don't have bodies. I have a body, as you see that I do. So he's asking them to get rid of your instincts here. Not really, just put them on pause, put them on hold, and use your sensory cortex, that part of your brain that does the thinking. Don't just allow the hypothalamus and the thalamus to make all of the emotional decisions for you here. Use that sensory cortex, do some thinking, and bring some context to what's actually out in front of you. And that's the next part of the brain that I want to talk about, is the sensory cortex. That sensory cortex, it interprets the data. Even though you can't avoid thinking the worst because it's trying to save you, that's in the first stage of fear, and that has to do with your imagination. You need to learn how to use that sensory cortex, to use your senses to actually bring the data in and not just make emotional decisions. Because look at what happens next. Jesus, as he continued to explain to them, the next verse says, as he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. And do you realize, even though he showed them his hands and his feet, the very next verse says, still they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. Now that's the kind of fear that we experience, that fear, that same kind of fear there. We experience that same, because this has to do with your adrenaline. But now, in other words, the emotional part is engaged, but they are now starting to think. They realize that it really is Jesus, but there's still disbelief, and they're still but filled with joy and wonder. This is the same kind of thing like when you go to Cedar Point or someplace where you get on a scary ride, because even though it's scary, you perceive now that it's safe. I think about myself. I when I first came to Michigan, I got on one of these rides, and it was all fun. But then after I became an engineer and saw how some of it worked, then I started having a little fear about getting on there, because I realized that if they don't maintain it properly, the worst could happen. But anyway, that's why some people can't enjoy certain things, because of where their brain is concerning that. But here, these guys were so excited now, it's still a form of fear, and it's translated disbelief, although that they see that it is Jesus. It's because their adrenaline, the emotional part of them, is there, but their thinking brain is now engaged. And that's the point where Jesus is trying to get us to. Engage your thinking brain along with your emotions, and enjoy the moment instead of freezing or running or fighting. Because he then asked them, because now he's settling in with them. Look at the next thing that he asked them. He asked them, he says, okay, it's really me. Do you have anything here to eat? They're wondering if is this still a ghost. He says, do you have anything here to eat? They gave him a piece of broiled fish and he ate it. And what did they do? They watched. He ate the fish as they watched. So you need to realize and recognize and decide and determine, with your sensory cortex, is this perceived threat really a threat? See, a perceived threat is when we interpret something to be physically dangerous, but we really are safe. But you interpret it as being dangerous, so your body goes through all of those steps that I just told you that fear takes you through, because it's an instinct, but really you are safe. And then when you realize you are safe, but your body stays in this same state, now you are starting to deteriorate some other parts of your body, because your body wasn't designed to be in this state for long periods of time. So here's your challenge this week. And I pray that you will take this challenge and work with this throughout the week and make a difference in your life this week. Make a difference in your life and the lives of those that you care about. So your challenge is, first of all, to notice, and I'm taking very small steps here, helping so that we can take these steps together. Your challenge is to first just notice. Notice on purpose what's happening with your mind, and notice on purpose what's happening with your body when you experience fear. That's the main thing I want us to do this week, is just notice what's going on with your mind and your body when you experience fear. And then give some attention to what is happening in the moment where where you're experiencing this fear, and how your instincts are reacting. In other words, you're either reacting and you're running, or you feel like you need to fight, or you freeze. So give some attention to what is happening in the moment and how your instincts are reacting, and then give those feelings or those responses a name based on what we just talked about, those 3 F's. Is this my fight feeling? Is this my flight? Or is this my emotions telling me to freeze? Now you're engaging your thought processes, you're engaging your cortex to actually think about it, which what you're doing is you're retarding the emotions from taking over. They can't just take over. If you let it slip through this part, they will take you to the next step, and you're going to either fight, flight, or freeze. But if you ask yourself these questions like Jesus asked these disciples, and if you take yourself to this point and go through these steps, you can stop the fear in its track. So here's some action steps to take for this. For example, here, when you consider whatever situation that brings fear to you, identify your response. That's what you're trying to do. Let's say that your response is to fight. Then if you feel like you need to fight, then allow the voice of Jesus to speak in your mind with the same question that he asked the disciples. Why are you afraid? Why am I afraid? When you ask yourself that question, then you realize that you are having if it's fight, you're having a fight response. Then just say this to yourself: I'm having a fight response. You're disengaging the strength of your emotions to allow fear to drive you to the next state. You're talking to yourself now. You're saying, I'm having a fight response. And I realize that my body is taking me through this. But even as you're saying this, you are slowing that process down from allowing your body to just take over and do that. And so when you say, I'm having a fight response, you are identifying the part of fear that you're taking, and you are not allowing it to actually take you to the next step. Now, let's say that your situation is that you feel like you need to run. You got the instinct to run. That's the flight. Well, then assess the situation just like you did in the other one with, where you felt like you had to fight. Assess the situation and determine if the danger is real or not. Think about, is this real or not? And by asking yourself this same question, why am I afraid? That's how you determine if it's real or not. Why am I afraid? And if something is going on that you need to run, then you need to run. But if something's going on, when you pause your instincts to ask this question, there's enough time for you to think now, and you are now thinking, and the emotions are still there if you need them, but you're thinking this through. Why am I afraid? And you're not allowing your instincts to make you run before you realize that you really need to run or you don't need to run. And you can relax and, allow your body to do what it's designed to do, with all that energy that you were using to run with, even though you weren't running. See, that's what happens. Even when we realize, okay, I'm okay, if you don't go through these steps and your body is still responding as if there is a threat, then that's becomes stress. Now your body's stressed out. Your muscles are tense and you don't have nowhere to run to. You don't need to run, but your muscles are all fired up. Your breathing is all fired up. Your heart is beating fast. Your digestive system done shut down. And you go through that enough, then you end up with stomach aches. You end up with all kinds of stuff, physical things that's happening in your body, and you don't even realize that it's all driven by fear. So acknowledge that I'm having a flight response. I'm feeling like I need to run, but as I look at this, I realize I really don't need to run. And then you can relax and shut that down. And then the last one is the freeze response. That's where, if you're the kind of person, or if you have the type of fear situation that causes you to freeze, do the same thing. Listen for the voice of Jesus again saying, why are you so afraid? What's going on that causes you to be so frightened? You need to ask yourself that question and then acknowledge that I'm having a freeze response. I'm shutting down because I'm scared. I'm paralyzed because I'm scared. And as you think through this, you are releasing the grip of being paralyzed as you go through these steps, because your emotions can't control you if you start to use your thinking. Now, if you let it happen, once you get to the point where you're in the state where, fight, flight, or freeze, you're gone. There's no, it's like trying to pull back a space shuttle. You are headed. There's so much energy that's got you going that your rocket is gone. You're gone. And so that's why you need to do this before you allow your emotions to take you to that next step. Now, this challenge is already uploaded on our Facebook page. If you want to download this, or if you want to just view it, you can go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/groups. It's our groups Facebook page, and groups/GTM USA. Then go to the files section, and it's the newest file there. All of our challenges are there, and you can click on it and download it, or just view it and take advantage of that this week. That's my prayer for you this week. So I'm going to pray for you right now, and then I'll come back and invite you to take some steps. So if you would, just pray with me. Father, I thank you in Jesus' name for these words, God, and for these experiences that the disciples went through that gives us light into how we can respond in our own bodies, and just allowing you to give us the strength and energy that we need to overcome situations where we allow fear to control us. God, help us this week to overcome certain situations that in certain times has us frozen and stuck where we're stuck. We can't go forward. And other times where we're running from everything, and other places where we are hiding and just not allowing ourselves to be ourselves, and then other times where we feel like we need to fight, where we need to dehumanize someone else in order to get rid of the fear that we are experiencing. God, help us in Jesus' name to allow your grace to have its place in our hearts, in our emotions, and in our bodies. In Jesus' name, amen.